Welcome to the Jolly Podcast. I am your host, Crystal Simeone, a Pan-African feminist working on economic justice. This podcast will be a space to explore inequalities, challenges, and opportunities around economic justice. We will focus on how we can promote care and apply a Pan-African feminist perspective towards socio-economic policymaking and practice in Africa. Subscribe to Jolly on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. Welcome to today's show. With me, I have Everlyn, and I'm going to ask her, as usual, to introduce herself in three ways: your personal, your political, which is also your philosophy as well, and your professional.
Okay, thank you for inviting me, Crystal. My name is Everlyn Muendo, all three names. So I'm a young student. As most people in my field would say, I'm a budding lawyer. I'm a final year student at the University of Nairobi. I'm also very passionate about research, specifically within the area of finance and development, but from a public policy point of view. And in terms of my political, the one thing that I can say are my political affiliations is that I'm a feminist. I will always stand for women.
Cool. And are you a student at the University of Nairobi?
Yes.
So you're in the same department as Professor Atia Waris?
Yes.
Great. It's so great to see her pass on the knowledge and the politics on to the next generation. So really, really grateful that you made some time out of your really busy schedule researching on what we will talk about, which is the Nairobi International Financial Center. Right. And every time I hear it, I don't know very much about it, but when I think of international financial centers, the first one that comes to my head, actually maybe the only one, is the City of London, which is also known as the 1 square mile. And in preparation for this, I sort of just Googled, the City of London, but I've also done a tour of the City of London, and a few really interesting things come to mind. So it has a population of 7,375, and it's called the 1 square mile because it is actually 1.12 square miles. And it's the smallest city in England. But interesting facts are companies and corporations can vote in elections. And it's also interesting that businesses have way more votes than actual people, like the actual people who live in the City of London. And I was listening to a presentation by Michaela Cole, who many of you will know from the new, from the show that's doing the rounds, I May Destroy You. And she said she grew up in the City of London, in a social housing estate built in 1977 to house homeless people. And she lived right opposite the Royal Bank of Scotland. And so the juxtaposition of, a housing estate for homeless people right across the Royal Bank of Scotland, in amongst this city that has very deep roots in very oppressive ways of making money. And a lot of it through my tour of the City of London is through the slave trade. Remember that they only finished paying the interest of compensation to slave traders. The interest of that was only completed in 2015. So a lot of that money is still there and permeates and really is the grounding for this obscene wealth in this square mile. But also, it's also really interesting that the City of London has its own representative in the British Parliament called a remembrancer, who has always been a man. And as the city's representative, he has privileged access to legislation that no other organizational group has. So farmers don't have this, nursing organizations don't have these, all these other forms of collective groups in society have no access in the way that the City of London has to legislation. So it really speaks to an imbalance of who gets to see and who gets a say in our legislation, and really the central role that private finance has. And so as I thought about that, and as I said, the City of London is the closest I can think of when thinking about an international financial center. Let's bring it home. Is it going to be the same? Like, did they reference the City of London? What's this whole thing about Kenya setting up a Nairobi International Financial Center?
Okay. So, those are really good observations. I think I'll keep touching on that example as we go on. let me start with where it all began. So it began with Vision 2030. You remember the development plan that Kenya had when it was launched way back in 2008. So the main aim of Vision 2030 in terms of the economy is to make sure that Kenya is a middle income country by the time 2030 gets here. And one of the ways that the task force decided that this would happen is that if they really revamped the financial services sector, it was identified as a key sector for us to get to where we want to in 2030. So the Nairobi International Financial Center was actually a flagship project under the Vision 2030 plan. So this has actually been in the making for quite a while now, and we've only seen some serious developments in the recent years, such as, for instance, setting up the legal framework for it.
Let's have a really simple definition of what the NIFC is and will be, and what it will offer private finance.
Okay, so I'll start with the definition of what the NIFC is. In fact, I'll just start with the definition. The NIFC in full is the Nairobi International Financial Center. So I'll just start with the definition of what international financial centers are. Let me give an analogy. Think of a one-stop shopping mall. Like, it has everything that you'd ever want. It has food stuff, it has clothes, it has furniture, it has everything.
Basically, Nakumat.
Yes, I was thinking about the whole, they used to tell us it's all under one roof. So that's basically what an IFC is, but for financial services, and specifically catered toward non-residents or foreign investors. So
financial services like what? Like banks, like insurance companies?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like international banking, you have the use of collective investment vehicles.
What is a collective investment vehicle?
So a collective investment vehicle, to put it very simply, is when you take capital from various people and then you collectivize it and then you direct it towards investment.
Can you give us an example?
An example of a CIV, a CIV in short, might be, for example, mutual funds. They can even be pension funds when you decide to invest them into various areas. So yeah, that's pretty much.
So if when I have my pension fund that I put my money away every month from my salary into a pension fund, is that what you're talking about? Would that come under that definition?
When those funds are invested, they have to be directed towards something specific. Yeah.
Why would I engage with the NIFC?
If you have an international bank like the Bank of they're all very interdependent, the various financial activities that take place here. For instance, you might want to be able to carry out international banking. You might want to be a non-resident who can actually use the banks that are based in that IFC for various purposes. So that's one instance. For example, if you are an entity that's just set up within the IFC, instead of having to go down, so to speak, to the level of the local banks, to the level of the local financial institutions, you want something that you can easily find within your resident country, as well as where you actually want to carry out the economic activity.
So the government has done an act around the NIFC, correct?
Yes.
2013.
2017.
2017.
Yeah.
There's a number of advantages that will be granted through this act. Eva, take us through, I think there were like 5 of them that we were talking about in preparation for this, of advantages that the NIFC will give.
So there are various advantages for investors that will actually be there. One of them is that they get to fully repatriate their profits, which is a very worrying clause. I mean, especially because of the wording. Full repatriation makes you wonder, so will they be subject to taxation or not? And even if you look at bilateral investment treaties, they normally are a bit more specific with that particular clause, repatriation of profits. So it's very worrying that within our domestic law, we've just left it to be that ambiguous, because we don't know what kind of controls will be placed on those profits or lack thereof in this case. The other advantage that they're being given is that they'll have 100% ownership of those entities. So this is a bit worrying because we have various protected industries in Kenya. We have the insurance industry, we have mining, we also have telecommunications, and there are normally laws within those specific sectors that require that Kenyans, that citizens of Kenyans, have a certain percentage of ownership in one way or the other. So for them to give 100% ownership is not kind of, but very worrying. The other thing is that the employment contracts that they have with any of the employees won't be subject to any domestic laws in Kenya.
So whose laws are they subject to?
They'll only be subject to work permits as well as any international labor laws that Kenya has gotten into, meaning that they won't be able to enforce any of their rights within the domestic courts of Kenya. So if you'd like to strike, you can't do that. You can't do that because it isn't provided for within your contract, probably.
Wow. So also let's talk about confidentiality. So if one of the Bank of Crystal is in the NIFC, are other people able to find out that Crystal Simeoni is behind the Bank of Crystal that is, working within the NIFC?
So what you're talking about is essentially what is called beneficial ownership, which is finding the natural person who's behind an entity like a corporation. So that is something that we've really been looking into, considering first, when you look at the transparency mechanisms that have been set up under the Act, there's supposed to be a website that is to have a register of all the entities that have registered under the Nairobi International Financial Center. But there's a caveat, there's a clawback clause, so to speak, meaning that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance is given full powers to decide what is appropriate information that will be published there. The other thing is that within Kenya, beneficial ownership, meaning finding out the human being behind an entity, is provided for within our domestic laws. That is the Companies Act. So if our domestic laws don't apply to NIFC entities, then how will we be knowing the beneficial owners behind any entity that is set up within the NIFC? Which means we're giving room for a lot of unscrupulous individuals to come and set up businesses here.
So all the world's dirtiest money can come and sit in our country, from drug dealer money to illegal human trafficking. All of that has an in our country, which is really interesting. You spoke about a lack of in terms of beneficial ownership, not knowing who the natural person, the actual person, living, breathing person behind this activity is. And I'm going to quote a paper that you were writing, and you said in a famous speech by the former President Obama in his campaign speech in 2009, he called out the now famous Ugland House, a building in the Cayman Islands that housed around 18,000 registered companies, saying either this is the largest building in the world or the largest tax scam in the world. Could that be a possibility for our future?
That is totally, it's definitely a possibility for our future. There was a study that was actually undertaken by UNCTAD back in 2015. It's the World Investment Report. And so what they did is that they studied places such as the Cayman Islands, pretty much offshore centers, so to speak. An offshore center is also like the International Financial Center, to find out what is their biggest use, what is their utility. And one of their biggest uses was tax planning. Pretty much tax avoidance, trying to reduce the amount of taxes that you're going to pay. So what companies do, especially big companies, companies that
foreign companies
that are established in a number of countries, what they do is that they pretty much look for a place that has low to zero taxes, and then they set up there. And they aren't setting up there to conduct any serious economic activity. They're setting up there so that they can avoid taxes, what is called artificially shifting their profits so that they can avoid taxes. So we call such entities shell companies. I've even heard of them being called letterbox companies, meaning that they're legitimately registered. They, as per the law, they are very legitimate, but they carry no substantial activities. So
all they have is a mailbox.
Exactly, they just have a postal address. I mean, the example that President Obama, as he then was speaking about, was a particular building that housed 18,000 companies.
That's ridiculous.
Which building houses 18,000 companies?
So let's pan back to us now. We're going through Corona. Mm-hmm. Our expenses as a country are like going out of the roof, mm-hmm. especially when, global supply chains have been interrupted. So it means pretty much we're on our own. We need as much money as we can to make sure that we have the capacity in terms of our hospitals, our social nets for people who aren't able, our food supplies are dwindling. So our expenses are really, really high right now. We need to go back to the basics of making sure that doctors are paid, that we have enough nurses, that we have community health workers, that we're able to feed our population. All of this takes revenue. Now, I'm having a hard time trying to think of what the reason could be to set up a tax haven. That means companies are not paying a large amount of tax in the NIFC, which will be set up in Kenya, against the backdrop of a country that it needs as much domestic resources as it possibly can get from taxation. Already our tax base is very minimal because a large percentage of our population is informal. Which means unless the burden falls on consumable tax like VAT, which we're struggling with, people are not able to feed themselves, that money legitimately has to be taxed. The tax needs to come from multinationals. And it's not a conversation of saying not pay your taxes, but pay your fair share of taxes in the place that you're supposedly registered and working in. So what possibly could the reason be behind setting up the NIFC?
In my opinion, what most governments would like to do is that they would like to generate as much economic activity as possible from the investors that are coming into Kenya. That is their intention. In short, I think they're hoping that the investment that they get will be greater than the revenue that they are losing, which is very risky. And the reason why we have so many speculations is also because they're never clear about whether they've done a cost-benefit analysis. And even if they have done so, it isn't really transparent. So that is the underlying reason why most of these governments are setting up international financial centers, including the reason why we're seeing so many international financial centers rising up specifically within Africa. They want to generate as much economic activity as possible so that they can cater towards their development plans.
So economic activity is really around private finance.
That's what they're fronting.
So the idea is if you can have 18,000 registered companies in one building that is paying a fraction of the tax, it's better than properly taxing less, like maybe 10 big companies that are actually doing work. And that is that sort of the calculation?
Essentially, that's what they're doing. They also make a lot of claims that it will generate a lot of labor, will give young people, especially in Kenya, you remember the whole Kazi kwa Vijana, will give young people opportunities to get employment, when really through the provision of employment contracts will not be subject to domestic laws except work permits. They're just saying we're going to bring a whole lot of expatriates who are really very well versed in these complex financial transactions to come and set up here.
So really, we're not questioning the quality of jobs that these companies are going to be bringing and who they will be employing, in terms of a disaggregation of how many women, how many youth stand a chance to get a job, how many persons with disabilities will be able to be absorbed into these industries. So let's talk a little bit about from what it seems to me from the outside, a complete lack of transparency around the planning around this, how it will work, who's involved, the legislation around it, the framework around it. Let's talk a little bit about your experience in terms of the lack of transparency around all of this.
Okay. So lack of information has been the biggest finding so far in my research. And I started noticing the lack of transparency at the very institution itself. There's very little information that you can find on the Nairobi International Financial Center Authority. And as I had said before, you can't even find the physical address.
Yeah.
You can't go visit their offices and see what they're doing.
Let's talk a little bit about transparency. And I know in our conversations, you've said it's been really hard to find information. And I think that's really interesting, considering that it's information that I think should be out in the public. So give us a few examples and talk a little bit about this lack of transparency and what it means.
So let me just say this from my research. I have realized that one of the most vivid red flags of any international financial center is the lack of transparency. And the very first thing when I was undertaking my research that I really wanted to find out is what incentives are they giving to NIFC entities? What tax incentives? What other kind of incentives are there? And I didn't find them because they're supposed to be made through regulations. There's supposed to be regulations that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, yet again, is supposed to come up with, but so far they haven't been publicly accessible.
So there isn't anywhere I can go to a website or something and say, if I want to be an NIFC entity, this is what my tax incentive structure would look like.
Yeah.
So how do people know? They know who to talk to.
Exactly. This is so interesting, especially considering the fact that we seem to be functional and operational as an IFC center. From the fact that we've been listed, we've been ranked 3 times. So it's either they're there, but they aren't accessible to the public, or they've never been made, and somehow we are operating without the proper legal structures. So it's one of those two.
So the latter seems highly unlikely. So
Yes.
The more likely one is that they're there. It's just that we're not allowed access to them.
Yes.
That's really interesting. And I'm really curious about, because as a young woman working in issues around finance with a legal background, what was the most surprising thing for you, apart from the transparency, in terms of actual things that you found in this like really long journey of trying to uncover information around this ever elusive NIFC?
One of the most surprising things that I found within the regulatory framework was what we'll call the supremacy clause, meaning that if that particular act on the Nairobi International Financial Center is to come into conflict with any other acts in Kenya, then the Nairobi International Financial Center Act will prevail. So it isn't an odd clause to find within acts. You'll find it in many acts. Actually, you'll find it in the Public Finance Management Act, which is the act that pretty much sets up the whole framework for our public finance. You'll find it in the Banking Act, but they normally have limitations. That's the thing. They say in this particular area, this act will prevail, but not in this particular area. So for it to completely declare its supremacy means that it's totally and completely above the laws of Kenya. And this is very worrying, in my opinion, because it sets us up for having a particular area within Kenya that is autonomous. Which is a trend in other international financial centers. For example, if you look at the Dubai International Financial Center, it's a financial free zone. They're completely autonomous. They are above and beyond the domestic laws of the country. In fact, they have a whole different system of courts. Yeah, they don't even operate under UAE law. They operate under English common law.
So we've spoken about the City of London. You've mentioned Dubai. I've heard a little bit about Doha. Are there any other financial centers in Africa that are up and running and that we're modeling after or that we're competing with?
Yeah, I really think that we need to begin showing more interest and begin casting more light on international financial centers in Africa. Because what happens a lot is whenever people hear offshore centers, whenever they hear international financial centers, the first thing that comes to mind is New York or London or the stereotype of Caribbean islands.
So they hear a lot about foreign financial centers in the capitals of the world, London and New York and Dubai and Doha.
Yeah, but we don't hear about Mauritius. We don't hear enough about Johannesburg and Cape Town. We don't hear about Nairobi. And most recently, we don't hear about Kigali.
Oh.
Kigali, Rwanda is also in the process of setting up their own international financial center, meaning that Kenya will be getting a lot of competition close to home. And it's also been a very opaque process. There isn't much information on the whole process so far. So it's something that we're really looking out for. Oh, I also forgot to mention Nigeria and Ghana as well.
Oh.
So, yes, African countries are really setting up these things, or at least they're putting plans in place to set them up. In fact, it was actually mentioned in the Mbeki report. I remember that it was mentioned that we have seen a lot of African countries that are moving towards this direction, but we also caution them against the risks of international financial centers. So this is something that's actually been taking place. And the saddest part about it is very few people know about it. We need to get it out there. We need to cast a little light on them.
So basically what we're doing is setting like little Cayman Islands across the African continent.
Yes.
Which also means that we're attracting private international finance who are not paying really their fair share of tax in the countries that they're setting up, who are not subject to labor regulations of the domestic legal framework, and who are shrouded really in a complete lack of transparency.
Yeah.
So nobody really knows what's happening, who is there. It could be criminals and all sorts of dirty type of businesses that are there and nobody would ever know.
Yeah.
And this happens at the expense of the priorities of a country in terms of delivering for her people education and transport and healthcare and all these things that governments really should be providing for their citizens.
Yeah.
So you've spoken about a lack of transparency. You've spoken a lot about in terms of priorities, what supersedes. You've spoken a lot about how the NIFC Act supersedes all our legislation and is really above the law. And so is there any hope, like going forward? Is there any way that any good can come out of the NIFC at all?
One of the most important things that you can do simply as an individual is talking about it. It seems very unhelpful, to be honest, to just tell people to talk about it, but it's important for one reason alone, that most of this happens and that ordinary Kenyans lack the proper understanding to understand exactly what's being done, to understand how it affects their right. So when we come together and simplify the whole idea of an international financial center and what it will mean for us, then I think we are doing our part in terms of making information more accessible to people out there. The other thing that we need to do as civil society organizations, let me now speak not as an individual, but as someone who works with CSOs, is that we really need to start demanding for access to information. We need to get to see what those incentives are. We need to find their physical address. People are aware that the Access to Information Act literally gives you the right to go to a government office and to inspect. So we need to start taking advantage of some of these things that are accessible to us as citizens. We need to demand specifically for financial transparency. We need to know if these people will be carrying out economic activity here, what economic activity that they're carrying out, who they're employing. The other thing that we need to understand is, are they only operating here?
Mm-hmm.
What about other countries? And are they paying their taxes in each of these countries? We need to understand who are the natural people behind these entities, who are the actual living, breathing human beings behind these entities. Who are they really benefiting? Are they benefiting us, or are they benefiting private investors who don't live here, who have no interest in our health systems, in our education systems that are for us? So this is something that we really need to investigate. I'd like to tell Kenyans, make no mistake, these things affect you one way or the other. You pay tax whether or not you're in the informal sector. So you have a right to demand for these things from the government. You literally have a contract between you and the government that they'll deliver this. So when there's something that affects their ability to deliver, you need to understand it. You need to be part of the process. You need to be there to say yes or no in essence. That's what I'm saying.
And so basically, this whole NIFC construct is taking away from our ability to contribute to the destiny of this country.
Yes.
In terms of who's here, how they're operating, what they're doing, who they're doing it with, and to what expense. I think that's really an interesting take in terms of closing as well. Thank you so much for taking time and sort of demystifying a few elements of this really murky, very seemingly complicated, but actually it's not very complicated at all, area of work that you're focusing on. And as a way to close, I'm going to ask you for 3 things. Could be music, song, whatever it is that's African that you'd like to leave us with.
Okay. I really like contemporary African novels. So one of the novels I'm really into, it was actually written by my friend. It's called Sins of My Father by EATGN. It's totally and completely based in Kenya. And I don't know, for me, I find it so rare to relate to a character. So I really like the main character of this book. And I also like how it tackles issues of abuse and mental issues in Kenya, because that's a topic most Kenyans shy away from. The other book I really enjoyed is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. The third thing is that I am very into local influencers, especially food influencers. I watch 1,000,001 food channels on YouTube. There's Kane's Kitchen Affairs. There's so many people out there on YouTube, and yes, you can get the perfect chapati recipe if you look out for it. African dishes are finally being documented in one way or the other, so I'm really happy about that.
So give us one food blogger to follow.
Kane's Kitchen Affairs.
Kane's Kitchen Affairs.
She can be found both on Instagram as well as YouTube. She plays around with spices. Also Kaluhi. Everyone knows Kaluhi.
Okay, so we're gonna put Kane's and Kaluhi as well.
Oh, one more person. Sorry.
That's fine.
So happy. Sheila NBU.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Eva, for spending some time with us and for really delving into the NIFC. And I must say, it's really amazing to see a young African woman tackle issues of finance, which sometimes, the space is so very male. And so it's so refreshing to see somebody else speak and, diversify the voices. And it's really, really important, the work that you're doing.
Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe and tell a friend, or maybe even two. Resources from today's show will be in the show notes. Ciao!